Good evening.
So, welcome home, as it were.
Good to be here.
Is there something when you get back to Indiana that you try to make sure to do that makes you feel like you're home?
Go visit my mom.
That's good. Moms like to see us.
That's required. I'll see her tomorrow, and I saw her for about 5 minutes on the way up here today. I just kind of swung by Carmel on the way up from the airport.
And is there something you find that you've lived in D.C. now for 20 years or so more?
I'm sad to say that is true. Yes.
Is there something you find that you miss about Indiana that you can't get inside the Beltway, or that you find that is different there that you wish was more like where you grew up?
Yeah, and I don't want to dump on Washington because it's actually a fascinating place full of people who have been all over the world. And many people who are patriots who work really hard for their country and really believe in it. And it's way too common to just kind of dump on Washington because we're dismayed with this or that policy result, or just because it's an easy way to talk. But with that said, there's a certain reality there, and there's a certain reality elsewhere. And you know, I think about my perspective on the world. When I think about my perspective on the world, it's clear to me that it emanates from here. And maybe I can take a minute and try to explain what I mean. There are all these debates about journalism, about how you should practice it, what your voice should be, so to speak. And there's a debate about whether journalists are objective, whether journalists can be objective, what even is that to be objective, what is truth, should you have a point of view, should you admit that you have a bias, whatever. Some years ago, there was, I think, a CBS News executive who had coined the phrase, the voice from nowhere. And that was actually their goal. The idea was to just take the person entirely out of it. Just be a voice from nowhere, giving the facts, giving the reality. That's an admirable goal, although I'm not sure it's really a possible goal because we're all human beings. And we as journalists, just as we should be doing as citizens, we're trying to figure out what's going on in the world. And we're trying to reach out to people who may disagree with us or may have different experiences than we do and learn what their circumstances are and figure out how we can deal with them in a democracy and in this wider world of many, many countries. And I bring a particular perspective to that. Now, that should not mean that I twist the facts or that I'm biased in that way, but I recognize that I come from somewhere, and the place I come from is here. I'm not a voice from nowhere. I'm a guy from Indiana who grew up here and learned whatever values I may have here, and went on to see a lot of the world, more of the world than I could really imagine when I was growing up here. I mentioned to a couple people tonight that when it was time to choose a college, I was accepted to Purdue, but I wanted to get far away from here, as far away as I could possibly imagine from Indiana, so I went to Kentucky. And thank you. It's a great joke, but it is literally true. And it actually turned out to be another world, a world away, because I went to Morehead State University in eastern Kentucky, which is a coal mining country. And my roommate was a fairly typical Morehead student in that when he was 12, his father died of black lung. He was a coal miner. And there were lots of sons and daughters of coal miners, or even people who at some point had worked in a coal mine, who were students there. And when the graduation ceremony comes every year at Morehead, they say, everybody who is the first person in your family to graduate from college stand up, and routinely half or more than half the student body stands up. I've seen it twice, and it teared me up both times. It's a very different place than where I grew up, Carmel, this very prosperous, then bedroom suburb, and now fantastic edge city with an amazing performance center and incredible stuff going on. A very different place. And in later years, I lived in Washington and then got sent overseas to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to China, to a couple dozen other countries. And all along, what I've brought to that experience is that I'm a guy from Indiana. I am from somewhere. And what I'm trying to do on the radio, when I ask questions of people, when I go see them where they live, is to learn something about their lives, their experiences, and relate it in some way to my own, in a way that I would hope brings people together or at least brings understanding. My goal is not to get you to agree or disagree with anybody I ever put on the radio, but my goal is to make sure you get them. You know what they're doing, or what they're plotting. You know why they're doing it, and you have some knowledge that you can use as a citizen. And all of that grows out of where I grew up here.
There are some people who I think are looking at the current political climate and listening to the news every day, and people have told us, I'm sure people have told you, the world is on fire. How can you possibly be doing what you're doing? And you have said that one of the things you try to do is try to find a way to have some fun, to take a lighter view, to smile, even if it's through gritted teeth.
Yeah.
Is this one of those times you're finding you have to do that more often?
Oh, why would you ask such a question? I've said this before. In fact, somebody quoted it back to me. Langston Hughes had a book of poetry called Laughing to Keep from Crying. I think it's a good way to approach things. When the financial crisis hit, I think if I changed my style at all, it was probably to be a little bit more of a smart aleck on the air, or just to have a little more fun with things, or even laugh at the absurdity of a horrible financial story. Because it's not that people aren't suffering. What else are we supposed to do? What else are we supposed to do? If you can laugh, that means you're not defeated. And there are occasions for laughter in recent times. This has been a really difficult and divisive time. It's been, in many ways, a difficult time to be a journalist, or at least it's taken some getting used to. When President Trump was elected, it was difficult for a lot of journalists. And I don't mean for the reason that the president might suggest. Oh, they're all biased against me. I'm sure some are. And some are quite open in their opposition. And others of us are working really hard to get the facts and get as much of reality as we can out through our various media. It was a hard event to deal with because this is a president who has a difficult relationship with the truth, says a lot of things that just are objectively not true. I think even if you're a supporter of the president, you acknowledge that, and has made a business out of attacking the media. And that was a difficult thing to contemplate as a journalist. Then there has been an extraordinary stream of news like nothing that any of us have really experienced before. So many things happening so rapidly, so many things seeming to happen so rapidly and not turning out to be that important, other things happening and being excruciatingly important. And it's been hard to keep up. But I think I've grown used to it a little bit, and I've realized it's actually a great time to be a journalist, because you can go on the air and say the craziest things, and they're just true.
Let me ask you, we've gotten some questions in from listeners,
Sure.
And a couple of them that go to that point you just made. Someone says, within the context of a continuous news cycle, especially considering a U.S. president who tends toward impromptu statements and tweets, how does the NPR Morning Edition team distinguish and prioritize which stories to air and which to leave uncovered? Are there criteria that guide the process, or is it based more on professional experience and intuition? And another person says, how is the information you report for the news verified?
Wow. Well, I have that's 2 or 3 different things. First, which stories do you pay attention to? We're never going to pay attention to everything, and it's just because there's only so many hours in the day and only so many hours in the program. And so we have to choose and focus and put our resources on the things that we think are important. Presidential tweets are an interesting case. I don't know if you folks are aware, the president is sometimes on Twitter. And he has a lot to say. And my opinion, if I can give you a little bit of media criticism, is sometimes people overplay their reactions to what he says. He will make a statement that is a little bit out of context or a little bit nonsensical, and we get all up in arms about it because the president said it. And it's a difficult situation because he is the president, and you have to pay attention to the president of the United States. But I think a lot, as a journalist trying to focus on things that matter, a lot of the things that he says on Twitter are better just let go, let pass. Let's remember, he is a very unusual person, but he's also a politician. He is very smart with Twitter. Even if some people in this room think he's being very dumb with Twitter, he is seizing attention, which is the thing that he wants to do. He's demanding attention on him day after day after day. And he's a very important guy and a very interesting story, but there are many things happening in the world. And some days, whatever he just tweeted, it's better to, not that we ignore it, we'll mention it in a newscast, we'll get you that information, we're not shutting it down, but we're not going to endlessly analyze it for hours on end because there are other things happening in the world. Those judgments of what we cover and what we don't, I don't know that there's anything scientific about it. I think that the important thing to do there is to make it a collaborative process. A lot of stories get to air because I think it's important, but I'm no dictator, I'm not even a manager. I can never say, pound my, you probably do this at WBAA, you pound your fist on the, Charlotte, get me that story. Right, does that actually happen? Yeah, she's nodding.
She's nodding her head, yeah.
Okay, so I'm not a manager, but I can believe in a story, and so it becomes a collaboration where I will go to the editor who's on duty, or the executive producer, the outstanding executive producer, Kenya Young of the program, or any number of other people, and we'll talk it over and decide whether to go after that story or not. And it might be an interview we need to do like 5 minutes from now because the story is just breaking, or it might be saying, let's go to Yemen, because there's a war in Yemen that's one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, and people sort of know what's happening, but don't really know what's happening. Let's call more attention to the war in Yemen.
Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, we totally can.
You've done some great reporting from Yemen and Afghanistan. You did this amazing live shot from Israel on Israeli Independence Day, and there was a Palestinian crisis going on next door to where you were, and you were trying to report on it as it happened. As you go and cover these things, does it give you a different perspective on the people back here who say the world is on fire in a first world country, and does it give you something else to tell them, like, you wouldn't believe what's going on in Yemen?
Oh, yeah, it totally does in a lot of different ways. First, you get a richer understanding of the rest of the world, and even though I tend to go to troubled places, if I come to your country, it's usually a very bad sign. I find the people there fascinating and relatable and not as weird or scary as perhaps people who haven't been to Afghanistan or wherever might think of them. And you recognize nuances of culture, such as the fact that Afghanistan has a war going on. It's a very terrifying place, and yet there's a culture of hospitality such that if you appear at the door of anybody in Afghanistan, even some horrible Taliban-type person in Afghanistan, they will take you into the house, serve you tea, talk with you reasonably politely, and not kill you. In fact, they will feel obliged to defend you if somebody came after you. There's this very strong culture of hospitality. So you learn nuances of a place, and you hopefully bring that back. Often when I come back to the United States, the world looks a little different to me. Even my street where I live looks a little different maybe than it did when I was there 2 weeks ago before I had this trip. But getting more directly to your point, you do get a sense very quickly of how bad things can get, which does give you perspective on where we are in the world. No matter where we are in the political spectrum, I think most of us feel kind of awful right now. People who did not support President Trump feel the country is being torn apart. People who voted for President Trump because they thought the country was being torn apart. There is a lot of anger and angst and dismay in this country right now. And it probably is good to just pause and remember that we're living in the wealthiest, luckiest, freest country that there has ever been. And that we have a lot to be proud of and a lot to be grateful for, and also a lot to be extraordinarily careful to preserve. Little bits of history are on my mind. For example, Afghanistan, where there was a prime minister who was assassinated in, I think, 1977, and it eventually led to chaos, warfare, a Soviet intervention, and they've been at war for almost 40 years. One war or another for almost 40 years. I think of Colombia, where I did some reporting years ago. There is an episode in Colombian history called La Violencia. It started around 1948, and it was a period where liberals and conservatives, that's what they were actually called, liberals and conservatives didn't get along so well. I think we can relate to this. And so people started killing each other, and 200,000 people were killed over the course of a decade. It is wise for us to remember how fortunate we are, how careful we should be with what we have, and also how much worse things can get. It's good to be mindful of how much worse they can get, both so we are grateful and also so that we are careful with what we've been given and blessed with and what we hope to pass on to our kids and our grandkids.
Let me ask you a little bit about your style and whether it's changed. You, people may remember in the audience, you took a little bit of flack in about 2009 for an interview you did with Michael Steele, the then Republican Party chairman, and he was having some trouble making his argument. You were calling him on some things, but there were plenty of people who said that you took him to town on the internet, but there were also plenty of people who said, why was Steve so mean to Michael Steele? And I wonder if that incident stayed with you at all, or if you got any feedback from people you respected in the business on that, and whether that, if true, carries over to today, where you're doing a difficult interview every morning, it seems like.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of difficult interviews, and I hope I've gotten better over time. You'll tell me if I have or if I haven't. The Michael Steele interview was a really interesting one because it began with what struck me as an untruth or a deception, a blatant one, because Michael Steele, who was chairman of the Republican Party at that time and had been lieutenant governor of Maryland, smart guy, had been around the block. In 2009, President Obama had just been elected and was pushing on health care changes, and he had written an article, an op-ed in the Washington Post, and I'm simplifying a little bit, but the gist of the article was, the government really needs to keep its hands off of our Medicare. Thank you. Some of you are aware that Medicare is a government program. And I got a little angry, which I think I am entitled to be. I'm not supposed to be angry about your policy, but I can be angry on behalf of the truth. And so we went in, we had the interview, and I don't know that I was so impolite, with all due respect, but it got rather heated because I pointed out that he was a veteran public official who was making this obviously nonsensical statement. And then he attempted to explain what he had meant more clearly than he had done in the newspaper. And so I said, okay, so now I understand you're trying to be nuanced here. And he got very angry at being told that he was being nuanced. He said, I'm not trying to be nuanced, I'm trying to be clear. This is a quote from the interview. And this got people laughing at him because people who understood the word nuance didn't necessarily take it as an insult. Although he did, because he was trying to give simple messages that everybody could understand. And the interview ended actually in a way that I think states what I try to do as a journalist. I ain't nobody special. I don't think I have any special privilege as a member of the media or whatever else, but what I am is a citizen. And that gives me every right to question my public officials. That gives me every right to expect answers from my public officials. And one of the things I said to him in that interview was, I realize that you're now upset, but I just want to tell you that as a citizen, I do not understand what you're getting at here. And so, yeah, we aired that interview and got a little bit of reaction, as you might imagine. And there have been many interviews since, and it's totally fine. We had an interview just yesterday with the 28-year-old Democrat who, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I believe, I may be getting the name slightly wrong, who just won a congressional primary in New York City, in Queens and the Bronx, defeating an incumbent congressman who was twice her age, and sending a kind of warning shot to the national Democratic leadership about what grassroots Democrats want right now. And we had this interview in which I asked her, I think, just straightforward questions. But they were hard questions, which I ought to be asking to everyone, from the right and the left. And on that occasion, it was people on the left, some of whom were upset, and spoke to me on Twitter and let me know how unfair my questions were. And my questions shouldn't be unfair, but they should be tough. They should be challenging. They should be substantive. And I should be asking hard questions of everyone on every side of the political debate. And not only should I always do that, I assume that you, or whoever's listening, expect that of me more now than at any other point. That wherever you fall on the political spectrum, we need to get down to the bottom of things. We need to be honest about what's going on. And I should always be courteous, and I try to be courteous. You'll tell me if I fail. I should always be respectful, and you'll tell me if I fail at that. But, we're going to ask the hard questions that have to be asked, and if something is false, we're going to call it that. And if there's a little bit of truth that we can get out of the world, we're going to do that too.
There's a long-standing journalistic aphorism that if you're making everybody mad, you're doing something right.
That's what they say.
So let me ask you.
I've heard a counter statement that if you're making everybody mad, it's possible you just suck. But
also,
we should consider all possibilities.
Anything is possible. Let me ask you about social media, because you responded courteously to the person who tried to take you to task about that yesterday. On balance, social media, as we sit here now, helping journalism or hurting journalism?
Mostly good, but a huge distraction, both for journalists and news consumers. Are lots of people on Twitter here all the time? Yeah, some people not so much. Or other media, Facebook, whatever. Instagram, not known for its political content, but lovely. Snapchat, I don't know. I'm running out of platforms.
How long until we have a presidential debate on Snapchat?
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. Or a Vine, a presidential debate. Like 6-second videos. You could do a 6-second debate. One says, "You're wrong. You are." The end. What was the question? Oh, yes.
You said you were just about to say how much of a distraction social media was.
I think, yeah, we're distracted. I think social media, for the most part, has been good because it is a wonderful tool, at least for me. I do a lot of reading through Twitter. Not that the tweets themselves are necessarily so long, but people will link to fascinating articles that I would not otherwise have seen. People will string a series of tweets into a little essay that has insights that I would not otherwise have had. And that stuff is all great. Where it can be a distraction is where everybody in your feed, and therefore in this smartphone that's with you all the time, is urgently telling you about something that you can't do anything about right now, or that 5 minutes from now or 5 hours from now will turn out not to be very important. Turn out not to be very important. There are stories that develop over a period of hours or days or months, and when that is the case, it could be that checking in every 5 seconds on Twitter is not really the best use of your time. There's a guy named Farhad Manjoo who wrote an article, I think, for the New York Times in which he performed an experiment. He attempted, I think, for a month to put away, somebody nodded, yeah, put away all social media, or as much of it as he can, virtually all of it, and just like get the news from these objects that would be delivered to his door. They were made of paper. They were called newspapers, and he would get 2 or 3 of them every day, and just like, so he would read the news the way that we typically might have just 10 years ago, and definitely 20 years ago, like a day later. And he argued that it was much better for him as a citizen because he would get the digested view of stuff that happened yesterday that was still relevant enough to put down overnight, and didn't have to worry about all the frantic flailing back and forth of things that might happen and the false reports and everything else. That's probably a good rule for you as a news consumer when there's, I mean, some horrible event that happens very quickly, I'm sorry to say, like a school shooting, something that's become very normal in this country. We want to pay attention to every detail of that. We really care about it as citizens, but the reality is that in the opening minutes or hours of that story, we don't fully know what's going on. There's going to be false information spread. There's going to be false reports. We work really hard to keep them off our air, and I think mostly succeed, but sometimes even we might fail.
Well, one of the things I've noticed that you do that I really appreciate, and I wish more news outlets would do it, is you have, in cases of breaking news, gone on the air and said, we are learning things as we are on the air.
Yeah.
There is the possibility that some of these things will turn out not to be true,
Yes.
but we are doing the best we can. And it's a human way to say, look, we're trying to gather the information, we're trying to disseminate it just as fast as we can, because that's the responsibility of a news organization, but we're human.
Yeah, it's totally true, and it's a great asterisk to keep in mind as citizens. And that's absolutely true in a breaking story like a shooting, but it can be true of bigger stories as well. I don't know how many people here recall the BP oil spill in 2010, which ruined my summer, and I bet many people's summers. Just horrible, horrible story, felt horrible all the time. The Gulf of Mexico was completely destroyed, except that a year or two later, we learned that while the environmental damage was very, very bad, it was a fraction of what it was thought to be at the time. I don't mean to minimize that story, but my point is that it seemed a lot worse at the time than it did after a couple of years of perspective, but it took a couple of years to learn that, to know that. I have a really specific memory of being home one afternoon after Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005. And my memory is that CNN was on in my house. And they had a helicopter shot of a house in the French Quarter. And the house had somehow, even though it was, there was like several feet of water, but the house was sticking up, it was on fire. And they zoomed in on the flames eating up the roof of this house, and it was just on the flames for minute after minute after minute. And having this on after a while gave me the impression that like New Orleans had burned down, like it's going to burn down to the water line. There's going to be nothing left except what's underwater. A short time later, I was sent to New Orleans and discovered that New Orleans had not burned down. I mean, it was one of the most horrible stories of the century so far, without any doubt, an absolute tragedy. And yet there was something about the experience of constant media attention that destroyed your perspective and made it worse than it really needed to be.
Let me ask you a question that's come in from one of our audience members that has to do with perspective, and this person says, why does the media continually normalize the actions of President Trump when these actions are so contrary to the rule of law? And this person goes on to say he's a despot in the making and no one is putting on the brakes. Is it your job to put on the brakes?
It's my job to tell the truth. If someone were to ask that question to me directly, I guess it just was asked, I'd respond first with a question. Which story of mine are you talking about? I don't find general media criticisms to be really useful. because there are many different news organizations. There are some news organizations I would barely consider news organizations. They're propaganda outfits, in my opinion. There are other news organizations that are working really hard and doing great work, but they have a particular political perspective. And there are organizations that are trying to tell the story as straight as they can in different ways in different media. And we're all doing different jobs. And I think a general attack on the media is an invitation to not think. It's an invitation to prejudice. It's an invitation to just not listen to anybody. And one of the most remarkable things to point that out is some of the fiercest criticisms of the media come in the media. I mean, you just turn on Fox News and you'll hear constant denunciations of the mainstream media. Fox News in its size and its influence is mainstream. They are what they are. And a criticism of one news organization may not apply to Fox News. A criticism of Fox News may not apply to one other news organization. And so I would ask that person, what is the story that you're concerned about? And let's go look at that story. That's my next suggestion, is let's look at evidence. What is the evidence that is behind your feeling that the president is being normalized? What is the occasion on which we've done that? And it could be we've done it, but let's go look. And there is a positive aspect to that. You know, if we're talking about my work, for example, or NPR's work, all of our work is in public. It's all searchable on a website. You can go back and look at the transcript of virtually anything we've done anytime you feel like doing it. And we can analyze whether we screwed that up. And sometimes we do.
Someone else, by the way, asks, what's it like being a journalist when the veracity of the media is being questioned?
Yeah, we can get into that, absolutely. I'm just thinking, reflecting on our own performance as a news organization. I think that there are occasions, particularly with this president, because of the way that he speaks, that we've just hit play on some piece of tape of something the president has said. And I think we should hear what the president has said, but if it was false, we should call that out. And I think we very often do, but I don't know that we always have. But it is not our job to say the president is awful, to say that we're not a democracy anymore. I wouldn't find that to be a true statement, frankly. It is our job to present the president as he is. Now, there's a criticism in that question from the left, effectively. You know, why are you not being tough enough on this horrible monster of a president? Of course, there's also a criticism from the right. Why are you only presenting negative information about this wonderful president who's only trying to save America? And we get a lot of that from a lot of our audience as well. And I have an answer to that criticism as well. My job is not to give a negative story or a positive story. My job is to tell a true story and to tell it well and to give you facts. And if you hear the facts and think that I've just done a negative story about the president, that means the president did something you are not comfortable with. And I'm not going to hide uncomfortable realities from you to make you feel more comfortable. It's my job to get realities out there in front of you. The other question that you asked there, though, was, the second question was?
How does it feel to be a journalist when the veracity of all media is in question?
It's tough, but I think it's good. It has reminded us all of the importance of being sure that we know what we know, and only saying what we know, and being sure that we can prove it, and working really hard to be transparent about it. You want to work really hard to maintain the trust of the audience that you have. You can't worry too much about people who don't actually pay attention to what you do and just kind of denounce the media generally. But you want to provide reliable information in which you cite your sources, in which you say how you've learned what you've learned. You make sure that you don't have any lazy assumptions in there. You check your facts many times. And when you're called into a specific question, you ought to be able to account for yourself. And as you know, Stan, those are all things that we all ought to be doing anyway. And so scrutiny of the media in general is really good. The same way that the media's scrutiny of politicians in general is really good. And we ought to be transparent. And all of our work in the end is in public and can be accounted for.
Allow me to digress for just a second and talk about something else that you do
Sure.
on the air a lot, which is you seem to enjoy singing when you are hosting the program. And I have to say, some of my favorite moments of the last year or so have been you trying, often in vain, to get Rachel Martin to sing along with you. This, to me, is great radio.
Low standards that you have there.
Are you just a frustrated vaudevillian that came along after vaudeville was gone, and so you had to be a newsman? Or, I mean, why is this, am I right? Is this something you seek out?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I just kind of enjoy myself, I guess, and I enjoy singing. Maybe the audience doesn't quite enjoy my singing as much, but I don't know that I've done it a lot, but I've done it a couple of times. I also talked like a parrot once. We had a little story, you know, we call them returns, the little bottom of the hour, 30-second things, and there was one of the teams, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, apparently during the NFL draft, had a parrot make one of their draft picks. And so I went on the air and I told this story and ended it by saying, "Bark, take the quarterback." I think I did it better then. But, bark. There was an executive at NPR, she's long gone now, but she talked about the requirement of being a program host, and one of them was, in her mind, that you ought to be willing to do absolutely anything. And in a way, I've taken that advice. In terms of stories that I should be willing to do, in terms of places that I should be willing to go, in terms of questions that I should be willing to ask, and maybe even singing a song. Anything that I can do to get the story across to you or to get the story, I ought to be willing to do that. It's not just singing. Do you want to talk to this musician whose music you're not familiar with, but who I think is important, a producer might say to me? And my answer really ought to be yes. If I can possibly do that, I should go for it. Do you want to talk to really diverse people, including people who are not like yourself? Yes, absolutely, all the time, all day long. That's my job. Do you want to get up in the middle of the night to put on a program that starts at 5 a.m.? Okay. Yes, I'll do that. And it's really been great to work with colleagues who have that same kind of spirit. There are several of us who are hosts now, but our schedules are very complicated because we travel places and do all kinds of things. And every once in a while, I might have to turn to my colleague David Green and say, "Can you cover for me tomorrow?" Which means, like, he's in Los Angeles and he's going to take a day that he wasn't supposed to be on the show, and he has to be in at about 1 a.m. Los Angeles time, because the show's going to be on at 2 Los Angeles time. And he instantly just says, "Yeah, I'm there for you." But you got to be ready to do those kinds of things, to jump through a few plate glass windows, and even to sing once in a while, to do whatever you got to do.
So a lot of people don't realize this, but those of us who work here don't work for NPR. We work for a member station that's part of a larger network. And we have a small...
Emily doesn't work for NPR? I thought she was part of the...
One
okay.
day.
Oh, that's right. Ixnay on the NPR next.
One day soon.
Yeah.
I tell all my reporters when they get to be famous, they should remember the little people who helped them along. But what can a local news department like ours or the many others in this state do to help NPR be better, help the national discussion be better? What can we do in Greater Lafayette, in your opinion, or perhaps even do better?
First, exist and do what you're doing and cover local news. It is vitally important that local affairs get covered well, and we're in an era in which newspapers have far, far, far fewer resources than they once had. They have fewer reporters. Once I was in a car with a woman driving through San Francisco, and we drove past the headquarters of the San Francisco Examiner, and she said they used to have several hundred people working there, they now have 35. Newspapers have been hollowed out in this country, and it's a horrible, horrible thing for democracy. But I'm proud to say that public broadcasting has stepped up and has filled some of the void. And there are a lot of news departments across this country that are a lot bigger and a lot stronger than they used to be. And, you know, I think it's important for any local news operation to be digging into stories that are not otherwise being covered and doing everything you can do, even with a relatively limited budget. A handful of people can do phenomenal work. And there's an opportunity there to add something that at the national level we just can't bring. People listening to WBAA ought to have a sense of this community, of this slice of the world, of what's happening here, of how national and international events are reflected here. This is, by the way, one of the most politically interesting states in the country. My fellow Hoosier, Asma Khalid, has been back here many times. She finds this place fascinating. As you know, Indiana voted for this guy named Obama in 2008, and then voted overwhelmingly for Mitt Romney, and then even more overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. That is quite a run. There are interesting things happening economically and politically in this state, and I guess what you guys can do is just cover the heck out of them. Do anything that you can do to get more deeply into the story. And, you know, once in a while you'll be filing for the network as well. There'll be something that feels like it has national resonance or national importance. In fact, that may happen frequently in a place like this. But even on days when that doesn't happen, people here need to know.
What could NPR do better? Was there anything that frustrates you about the way the organization?
No, nothing at all frustrates me. We're learning all the time. We're learning how to collaborate better within the organization. It's not the largest news organization in the world, but it is hundreds of people. And there are little subcultures within NPR, like there's groups of reporters called desks, like the National Desk or whatever, and there's shows like Morning Edition. And we're always straining to collaborate in ways that we complement each other's work and improve each other's work rather than kind of clashing and battling over things and covering some things well and some things not so well. I'm really, really pleased that NPR is putting some money now into a large project that is designed to improve collaboration between member stations and the network so that we as a network have a better real-world, hour-by-hour sense of what you already know here. Our presumption is that there is an immense amount of information available to reporters and editors across the system that we at the headquarters don't even know about, or maybe we don't know about it until tomorrow or next week, and it would have been better if we knew today. And that collaborative effort is going to involve personnel, it's going to involve editors in different places, it's going to involve different workflows and different ways of working and things that I can't even explain to you here. But the idea is to make this network truly a network so that what you're doing for WBAA, which already supports NPR in many ways, by the way, supports it even more.
One of our questions from the audience asks, what is the path for news reporting to return to a more unbiased perception? So I guess regardless of whether you think the facts are being offered as unbiased and objectively as you can do it, how do you get people to believe that's the case?
Well, I will begin with a number. And it is the following. We are in an era in which lots of people are told not to trust the media, and lots of people don't. But when they do surveys of American voters, the most trusted news sources very frequently include NPR. There was a Pew survey, it's a couple of years old, I don't know what the numbers would be now, but it found that NPR was the most trusted source for liberals and the second most trusted source for conservatives after Fox News. We have a politically diverse audience. We have lots of different kinds of people who are listening or reading or even watching video produced by NPR who find something of value in that experience. And that doesn't mean that they all agree with everything that we report. Of course, I hear from the people who feel otherwise. But here is a specific number for you. The audience of Morning Edition has reached the highest levels in the history of the program. The audience, I don't have the exact current number, but it's up close to 15 million people listen to Morning Edition at least once every week. And of course, most of them are listening several times. Any given morning, there's 6, 7, 8 million people tuning in. There is an audience of, I think, 37 million people for NPR stations across the country. That's a really large percentage of the United States that is tuning in more and more to NPR programming, and I think finds something of value in it. And I guess that sounds like a boast, because it is a boast. But I would hope that we can continue to earn people's trust and earn people's time by working hard to be transparent, by working hard to be clear, by working hard to be frank about what we don't know. I appreciate you saying that about us explicitly saying when we don't know something. And to try to draw the audience into the experience. I'm not trying to influence your vote. I'm not trying to make you go one way or another. I'm not trying to make you hate anybody. There's an awful lot of media that is designed to hate, to get you to hate somebody. What I'm trying to do is figure out the world and figure it out with you, often live on the radio, and sometimes with your assistance when you tweet me to tell me I made a mistake, and sometimes you're right. We're all figuring out the world together, and we are working really hard at NPR to be part of that discussion.
There are a couple of interesting trends in journalism over the last 5 or 10 years, maybe 20 in some cases. One is this idea of solutions journalism, where journalists shouldn't just say, the world is on fire. Mm-hmm. You should say, and here's how you can put it out. Uh-huh. And there's others who go for what they call advocacy journalism. If you believe you have found the right way to do something, you say, not just, you just ask the question, but you say, and here's why this is the way something should be solved. Yeah. Do you believe in either one of these, or do you go with some people who say, this is a really slippery slope away from objectivism? Well,
I think that it's totally cool for people to do that, to be advocacy journalists. One of the people that I worked for very, very early in my radio career, I was briefly at a station called WBAA in New York City, and the news director was Amy Goodman, who later became more famous running a program called Democracy Now! Some of you maybe know it here. And I think it's fair to say that she's an advocacy journalist who has a point of view and pushes it very hard and also presents facts and information that maybe wouldn't be found elsewhere. I'm a big admirer of Amy Goodman, but she doesn't do what I do and I don't do what she does. It's just a different way of approaching the world. So my answer to your question is, I'm not going there. But it's okay that she's there and doing that. It's fine.
Are you both journalists?
Yeah, I mean, she's going out and interviewing people. I would give a loose idea of the word journalist. I would suggest that there is a problem that has crept into journalism that maybe is being corrected a little bit by social media in a messy way, and that is that journalism was professionalized, which sounds great, but what it means in practice is that a bunch of like-minded people were taught to be more like-minded by going to the same kinds of schools and learning to do the job in the same way. Whereas journalism used to be a little more open, I think, and small d democratic. That's not, that elite notion of journalism isn't the way that it is supposed to be. We've now maybe gone a little more on the other extreme. I mean, anybody who has access to a social media account can act like a journalist and start like putting out facts or non-facts. Anybody with a little bit of investment can create a media platform and start spewing facts or propaganda, whatever it is. But it's worth remembering that there is a special thing about the profession of journalism. It is a profession in which you are required to have no qualifications, experience, or knowledge whatsoever. As it says in the United States Constitution, freedom of the press. They can't stop you from printing things. And I think it's actually okay to have a wider range of people attacking things. I think it's okay to have Vox, this wonky, policy-laden, deeply involved website that comes from a leftish point of view, but they have lots and lots of valuable information, and I read their stuff all the time. I think it's okay to have National Review, which is a journal with a lot of stuff that I might disagree with, along with a lot of stuff that I might agree with. It's opinion, but they are attacking issues that they find to be passionately important. And you might have someone working for National Review like Robert Costa, who was sent by National Review to cover Congress. And so he was at this conservative opinion journal, and yet he was writing fact-based reported stories about what was going on inside John Boehner's House of Representatives, and it was such fascinating stuff that he rose and got people's attention. He was on our air a lot, then was hired by the Washington Post, and is now a very important media personality and does Washington Week on PBS. And that grew out of an opinion journal, not straight journalism. I think you need all sorts of different points of view out there, but people ought to be relatively transparent and clear about what they're trying to do. The stance that I take, or that NPR takes, is that we're not pushing our opinion. We're trying to learn about the world, we're trying to dig into the world, we're trying to investigate things that bear investigation and get the facts out. And it might be revealing something about the White House that you didn't know, or it might be taking something that is purely in plain sight and calling it to your attention because it's important. My former co-host, Renee Montaigne, has gone on to do investigative work, and some of you perhaps heard her reporting about infant mortality and maternal mortality rates soaring in the United States to the point where it's far worse than almost anywhere else in the developed world. That was a shock to a lot of people last year. It was a huge story. It was picked up by many other media, and it's won every award that there is to win. I think that's really valuable work. I don't know that Renee ever expressed an opinion, but she and her colleagues went and revealed a lot of information that we ought to know about, because it's when we know about something that we can try to do something about it as citizens.
So you've hosted Morning Edition for nearly a decade and a half now.
Sorry to say yes.
Is this the last job you're going to have at the network? Do you envision yourself like Robert Siegel, where you're there for 30 years, or do you hanker to go and do something else at some point?
I'm always trying to learn new things. I've been doing some stuff for CBS News recently. I've done a few pieces for them. And I'm continuing to write books. I'm working on my third book. I'm doing other things.
What's the book about?
This latest book is about John C. Fremont, the Western explorer, and his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont. Fremont went out through the West in the 1840s and 50s. He didn't actually discover that much that was new, but he was brilliant at promoting what he had gone and seen. And through that, he promoted settlement of the West and also promoted himself. And he did that promotion by writing best-selling accounts of his adventures, except that scholars have discovered that when you go look at the manuscripts of his best-selling accounts of his adventures, some of them are in the handwriting of his wife. And it turns out that Jessie Benton Fremont was the daughter of a senator, politically influential, his writing partner slash editor slash ghostwriter, and an amazing character in her own right. And so I'm working on this story of these two ambitious young people rising in America just at the moment before the Civil War, when the country was about to fall apart, which feels like an interesting and resonant moment to talk about right now.
And so what about, I got you away from the question I asked you.
No, I got away from that question, actually. I did a good job of that. No, I'm going to do it as long as, it's the best job in the world. It's also a very hard job. I don't know that I can do it for 20 more years or whatever, but I'm still learning how to do the job. I have been doing it more than a decade, and I'm still figuring out how to do it well, or how to at least do it a little bit better. And as long as I'm still learning, I'm probably going to still be doing it.
We're running a little short on time, so game show fan that I am, we're going to do a lightning round here at the end. And I just want you to answer quickly when these things come to mind. You're right to sit up in your chair.
This is Jeopardy!
That's right.
All right.
Who's the NPR colleague that you're closest to?
Bruce Auster.
Who's the NPR colleague you wish you were closest to?
I'm not going to answer that.
What is your favorite word or phrase that you are absolutely, positively never allowed to say on the radio?
Oh, one that I like, but I'm never allowed to say on the radio.
You cannot say on the radio, yeah.
I can't say it here also. It's a family situation.
Oh, sure you can.
No, it's an adverb.
Okay.
Anyway, go on.
What's the funniest thing one of your kids has said to you recently?
Wow. There's just such a long list. Let me think about that. Can I describe a thing that one of my kids did recently? I was describing this at the table earlier. We have a 3-year-old. She just turned 3. And she saw her mother salting the driveway last winter. So she took the salt to be helpful and salted the living room.
You're back in Indiana. Sugar cream pie, best thing ever or most disgusting thing ever?
Not sure I've ever had it.
Don't try it. It's terrible.
Okay.
Of how many public radio stations are you personally a member?
4.
What are they?
WBGO, WFUV, WFYI, and WAMU.
Could it be 5 by the end of the evening?
We'll work on that. We'll work on that.
What is a talent you possess that few people know you possess?
I don't have any talents.
None whatsoever?
Singing.
So you're a decent singer?
Well, no one knows that I can sing because they've heard me try to sing and they know that it's not very good.
What person, living or dead, would you interview every day for a long period of time if you could?
Abraham Lincoln.
Why?
Because he's the most interesting president, and because there is in his life this period of seeking to learn and seeking the right way to do things, not just some guy who was born brilliant.
And lastly, when it comes time for you to finally decide that you will hang up your press pass, what do you want to be remembered for?
Hopefully that I told the truth.
Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Inskeep.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Enjoyed it.